Well, welcome everybody. When we're small enough group, we're going to try to keep this fairly informal and chatty. We have a few presentations. We're going to do self-introductions as a panel. So my name is Patricia Elliott. I teach in journalism. My involvement in community-based research was actually started when I was working out in the community, long before I came to the university, and I sort of pulled that into my classroom once I started teaching here. So that's me.
Bruce Anderson. I teach in the business school, entrepreneurship and strategy, but I also operate a business in town and be creative with a partner and some staff. And my involvement with the more community-based activity has been in the classroom, and so I'll speak to that side of it. So if that's what you're expecting, it'll work out fine.
And I'm Robyn Edwards-Bentz. I'm the CEO of United Way Regina, and my most recent experience has been with my partner here. Bruce Anderson and I have worked on a project together, and we're here to share about that. If that's what you're here to hear about, that's going to be great. It's going to work out really well.
Yeah. And we, of course, all want to hear about you as well. We were going to do a little show of hands as to who's from where, but I think we're a small enough group that we could actually very quickly go around. If you could just identify if you're a student, faculty, if you're just here because you're curious, that sort of thing, and so we get to know each other a bit by name.
Two hands if you have multiple choices.
Yeah. But yeah, just give a quick sort of who you are and why you're here.
Sure. My name is Lana. I'm a student with the Masters of Human Resource Development thesis program. I'm halfway through the thesis and I teach at South Fullerton.
Chantal, I'm a Master's Indigenous Education student and I teach at South Fullerton.
Greg, I'm an Indigenous Nursing Student Advisor at South Polytech, and I'm also the chair of 3 different CBOs.
Hi, I'm PhD student at Faculty of Engineering. I'm interested in this topic as community-based research because I was working in this organization, education field.
Great.
We're just doing some self-introductions real quick.
Oh, sure. Yvonne Hansen, Shepherd Food Consulting, Security CPO.
I'm from the University of Saskatchewan and doing my PhD study in education.
Okay.
Carol Browers, and I manage the Regina Local Immigration Partnership, and I'm here because one of the roles of a local immigration partnership is to support community-based research, whether it's initiated by us or others.
I'm Rochelle. I work with Carmichael Outreach. I'm the Communications Advocacy and Projects Officer. And I'm here because I'd like to do more research. Advocacy is part of my title, and so I really want to be able to use research to the best of my abilities.
Aaron, we're just doing real quick. Nan Mackay, activist at large.
That's an understatement.
Florence Loranga, Faculty Member in the Faculty at Yoga.
Tracy Nixon, and I work with a group called Stops to Violence.
Joanne Michael, I'm with the Alzheimer's Society. We work lots with researchers, but certainly want to strengthen that partnership a bit more.
Carolyn Hofford, South Polytech Psychiatric Nursing Program Faculty.
I'm Lynn Gidluck, the person that's been on the other end of a lot of emails to a lot of you, so please come and introduce yourself to me at some point in time. It's been really fun organizing this event, and it's nice just to see so many interested and enthusiastic faces.
I'm Jenny Bryant. I'm with Early Childhood Intervention Program in Regina.
My name is Mirta. How can I define myself? I'm not an activist, but I'm a conscientious citizen in the community. I'm on the board of Carmichael and many other boards, and I'm part of a writing relations circle in Regina.
I'm Sandra. I'm a master's student doing interdisciplinary in fine art, film and arts education, with my thesis being digital media as a voice for marginalized people.
Friends Sitaway. I just finished my MA in Sociology, Social Studies with a focus on animal ethics and animal advocacy, and I've been involved in the animal advocacy community for over 20 years now.
I'm Yasmin, I'm a third-year student in art.
I'm Nancy Young. I work for the nonprofit Saskatchewan Parks and Recreation Association.
I'm Leah Levac, and I'm faculty at the University of Guelph.
Denise McDonald, Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation.
Carrie Strathy with Lifelong Learning Center at the University of Regina.
So we're looking at university instruction and community partners and community service learning, capital area in this workshop. So we've got some great experience from the community and in Robyn and Bruce having worked on as a faculty in partnership. So maybe are you sort of presenting together, or do you want to go first, Robyn, or sort of
well, if we're going to do it, I'll go first.
Absolutely, sure.
So in the business faculty, we well, it's been my interest to try to do a lot of things that are around community-based learning. Getting students out to understand the various projects they're doing, give them an exposure that's beyond just a profit as bottom line kind of interest and things like that. So we've been doing lots of looking around those things, and we built a consulting class for our graduate students, our graduate business students, and 5 years ago we delivered the class, and we brought it back again this year. And the class this year, so we were looking for some projects that we could actually provide real life experience for the students. And Robyn and I have known each other for a long time. I've been involved in the United Way and things like that. So we already had a relationship in that sense. I had a comfort level in terms of those kind of things. And so my class basically, so the premise that we used, if I can back up for a second, the premise we used for the master's students is that, and I think this is true with many master's students in all different disciplines, is that you're either informally or formally, you could be in a consulting role, whether you're called that or not. You could work externally as a consultant, or you could be internally in an organization as a consultant, whether it's a school system, whether it's a not-for-profit, whatever. And so we try to provide our master's students with that kind of perspective. And it really focuses on the creative thinking and the problem-solving kind of processes. So we created this consulting class and took them through a variety of steps. And so what we did is and I'll let Robyn's going to do a lot more around what it was important to with the organization and how it actually worked. But we set up the process. The consulting process involved the students having to form into two different groups, two different themes rather. The United Way came to us and said, we have two different issues that we want to identify. Robyn speak to those. One is how can we involve millennials much more in terms of the future of the organization? How can we, particularly in the funding of the organization as its donation donors basically age, and how can we, in the second project, and maybe you're familiar with, but the Saskatchewan 211, went live, and so this project was in advance of that. Went live with the phone version of it, had been online before that, and so how can we get important audiences engaged in using that service, and also what should the focus be in terms of that service delivery, if you will. So these are the two problems that were identified by the United Way. We didn't identify the problems. We talked about, Robyn and I talked about whether it was feasible for us to solve the problem, whether we thought it would be viable. Then we took them through a process, and so we made them, my involvement was as an advisor. They had a dual reporting structure. So I was theoretically their boss, the grandiose thought that I could be their boss. And then Robyn was the client. And so Robyn and her team were the clients. And so the students had that dynamic to work through as well. So they first had to start off with engaging the client, so they had to prepare for that very first meeting, which is how do we gather the information we need? Because they don't know the United Way necessarily. And so how do they get the information from the organization to actually be able to understand what the problem is in the first place? Because their first job, I said what the problem was, but I didn't tell them what the problem was. So they had to define that. And so the initial process was that Robyn and her team came to a class setting. We had the United Way present sort of where they were at, the situational analysis, if you will. And the students had to prepare for that meeting. They had to run the meeting, had to ask the questions, they had to share they had to have an agenda full of outcomes that were designed. And so once that happened, and they were able to follow up with the United Way as needed be, then they set up basically a proposal. Here's what we can do. They didn't have any money to earn from this, and the United Way wasn't going to pay any money. So that part was missing from a proposal, but everything else was basically a project planning document. What happens first, what happens next. And so then it was part of what we called a letter of understanding, which meant that they had to agree in a little bit more than a psychological contract. They had to agree to, this is what we'll deliver. And that improved the accountability and so forth. And then they had to, so they started doing this. The United Way looked at it and said, okay, this is okay. It looks like the groups have matched that expectation that we had. I looked at it. I was able, in the first two exercises, to grade those according to a matrix. And the second was they had to do a diagnostic report. They actually had to figure out what the problem was. And of course, as all of you know, we often focus on a problem, but we never get to the root cause. And so these guys had to focus on what is the root cause that they were going to work on. And I mentioned that there was, interesting enough, there was two groups that were working on each of these projects. We had 4 groups in total. 2 were working on the millennial issue, 2 were working on the SAS 211. And so the interesting situation in there is while they had commonalities, they had a different problem and they had a different approach, which sounds really confusing for Robyn, but I think she'll tell you that there was benefits in doing that. And I wasn't going to force them into a pattern because they had to, we had one group that was was dominant in international students, and they had a different kind of experience than another group, and we had another group that was largely more professional in terms of working careers than other students, and so these students had to find their strengths and work that. So they went through the diagnostic. They had to prepare a report for me on what they thought the problem was, how they were going to address it, and they had to go through a whole bunch of tools to use that. That was part of the learning as well. And again, I marked that the diagnostic didn't really get to the problem, or it didn't get to the recommendation. That had to come in at a later step. And the reason we divided all these pieces up, we could have done a large consulting program, which would have been very difficult for Robyn to digest. I think, anyway, for me to digest, I won't speak for you, but for me to digest, and in fact, give an early reporting back to the students. So how could they get, and how could we keep them on track? And so we had to provide early evaluation pieces that they could do. So we did it in segments. Then they ultimately produced an action planning document, which the students were not going to be able to, and the weakness of this exercise is the students were not going to be able to actually, according to this morning's discussion, actually be able to action this. First off, they're not the client, and the second is their term ends, and so that's the relationship. And then the student had to package all of that in a final report, which was made to Robyn and her team. I'll let you talk about how you divided up that work. And so the presentation to the client was critical. And then the final sort of evaluation we did beside that was the students had to produce a learning journal. They had to take the takeaways from their entire semester and what I took from it. I'd only used the learning journal idea once before. Can't say that I was a huge fan of it, but the students predominantly enjoyed the exercise. enjoy is the wrong word in an academic setting, but the students welcomed the exercise and participated in the exercise. And so that was the piece. But I've got all sorts of, one other piece that happened during the semester just to help the students. Because again, while I might have been the so-called managing partner of the consulting firm for these students, they would get help from me and I'd help them make sure that they were on track with deliverables and outcomes and things like that. But we brought in an expert panel of other people that were familiar with this kind of work. And the students got a sense of how those, had a panel presentation on that. And then we allowed we had 4 panelists, and each of those panelists broke up and worked with an individual student group and just gave them, they said, here's our problem we're having with this project or not having, and we're able to get independent advice. So if I wasn't ever clear in terms of my expectations, they got another chance to do that. And so maybe I'll just stop there, but so one of the challenges that we had initially is that the diverse knowledge base that some students had. Some would have it because perhaps their parents gave the United Way or were familiar with it, and others had virtually no knowledge. And so that was something we had to get past. But I'm going to leave it to you and cover off the real important stuff.
Well, I don't know about that, but maybe that's a great segue into where I wanted to start. Because from a United Way perspective, we've done a lot of projects with consulting firms. And sometimes it was great, and sometimes we really missed what we intended at the beginning. What I would say I really found valuable about this process was that the students took it very seriously in terms of the research and getting to know and understand the United Way. And so we've worked with consultants that missed that part and dove straight in, and they didn't get us. They didn't get our values or the way that we worked. They didn't get the nature of our business at all. So of course at the end, your final product it isn't as good as you had hoped, and you put money out. So I really, really found it important that they just went after the project with so much enthusiasm, and we really appreciated that. I guess from our perspective in terms of divvying out the work, we knew at the beginning that there's going to be some staff time, right? Nothing is ever free, and that means if you're working on this project and we had 3 or 4 staff supporting it, that means that's time away from what they have to do during the normal day. Doesn't mean the normal stuff goes away, they have to do both. But we had some good conversations up front with our staff, our managers, and talked about the value that we would get out of the project by devoting the time. And we agreed that this is something that we wanted to pursue. So unlike, though, I would say for many, you would have the experience that we have had, whether it's running a grant application, all of that is time consuming as well, right? And so that whole process will take a lot. And yes, you may at the end be successful and get a grant, or you may not. This, at least we knew we were going to get something. We had no idea what we'd be left with, but it was worth it for us to pursue. And we thought that connecting in our community, getting to know potential donors or future interested partners or volunteers. We do a lot of our work through volunteerism. This would be a worthy endeavor from our perspective. I can't say enough. I don't know how it would work for everybody, but I can say that because of the history that I had and our organization had with Bruce, that made it ever so much more successful. Probably there would have been more pre-work required for someone who had no idea what United Way was. How could Bruce, in class answer questions? There was very little back and forth. Times that we came and had entertained some questions from the students, it was very brief. We're not talking hours and hours of connection, but I think probably you answered a lot of questions on your own that we saw. We didn't see that happen behind the scenes. And to be fair, when we went for our first in-class presentation, Bruce, sort of did an overview of what United Way was, probably better than I could do. So that tells you right out the gate that that was a unique experience. But I think if I wanted to just run through sort of the benefits that we found from the whole process, like really, if you think about this, we walk into this room, we're excited about this project, that there you have 20 to 25 students, different ages, different backgrounds, different perspectives, all together going to collaborate and work on your behalf. That value of diversity and diverse perspective was just amazing from our perspective. Did some of the information come back, things that we already know? Yes, for sure. Was it all brand new information in the final reports? No. And I would say, if I had to guess, I would say probably 75% was, yes, we had already figured that out ourselves, and the other 25 would be, wow, we never even thought of that. But if you think about 4 groups and getting 25% of, boy, we never ever thought of that, that's incredible, thanks for sharing that with us. That's actually very valuable. It was worth a lot for us. And I think there's a lot to think about as you work through the process. And for us, we are really excited about this perspective. We are really excited about the cost, or lack thereof. We were very excited about the connection to the university. And that's another 20, 25 students going out and talking about with their friends and their peers what they're learning about, which was United Way. And also there was value beyond our expectations. So at the end of this, we received all the final reports, and we have those tangibles to walk away and now begin to think about how can we implement. But beyond that, we also, Bruce, his class was featured in the Horizon publication, which is a publication for business students that went much farther and broader than we had anticipated. And here we are today, speaking to you about our experience. So again, what started off very small, it's this compounding benefit throughout the process that it absolutely was worth our time and effort, and we'd be excited to do it again if we were trying that again. Was there challenges? Sure, there's always going to be challenges, and I think, again, just to say that we were lucky. I think when you go through a consulting project, you spend a lot of time mapping out what the scope of work is going to be and going back and forth with your consultant on how that's going to be managed. We didn't have as much time, and the students were certainly on a timeline. So probably if we didn't have that relationship, or if we had had a different experience, we would have added more to that to make sure that we're going to get a good quality, and that we were able to narrow the focus, because that was left up to the students. They heard a lot of information from us, and it was up to them to narrow it and sort through what were the most important pieces. So probably we would have done more work on that. From a staff perspective, they were glad to participate. They really liked it. Because of Bruce's suggestions, we're not going to set this up where every student just bombards United with questions. He certainly pulled that in and said, you have to remember this is a nonprofit organization. You're going to have to be thoughtful in your questions and don't go back and forth too many times. I didn't receive the questions, my staff did, and so certainly they worked through all that. But I think those parameters were really helpful, because I think it could get out of hand if you didn't sort of put some parameters in place. And I think without that, probably the students would have been frustrated, and so would staff, if it was back and forth all over the place. I think one of the challenges that our staff experienced was that final day when we came and we heard the presentations. We were so thrilled to participate. We were so thrilled to see real enthusiasm from the students. They're just proud to share what they had worked on for many months, and to be sort of asked to critique or provide some feedback that may impact their grade. Ooh, staff didn't want to do that. They wanted to be very positive and want to make sure that that we're used to working with volunteers, and we're so happy to get any kind of support that we can get. So to critique, that was a little bit stressful, I would say. And certainly the project isn't for everyone. And what I would say about that is we knew going into it, the students would be graded on it, and so that was a part of the commitment that we had back to the students. We knew that when they reached out wanting a question clarified or information clarified, it had to be timely. You couldn't let it sit for a week or two, because that stalls the whole process. So we knew going in that we had to be very responsive and respectful, because they're counting on this, and it's a group team working together. And if they don't have this information or they don't have clarity that they need, they can't move forward. And I could expect that that would be very frustrating from the students' perspective. So we knew that was going to be important, and we had the ability to plan for it and be ready for it. Not every organization will probably be in the same boat. And especially when you're doing frontline service, you know, every day is a different day, and you never know what's going to be coming your way. So there may be challenges with that we didn't have as an organization.
Yeah, and so I think on the one project we came up with, many of the students focused on a persona, a giving profile of who would the future giving person be with United Way and how to reach them. And obviously things were like that with social media and the like. And with the Saskatchewan 211 project, it was around who should be prioritized. Is it a rural versus urban? Is it, you know, do you provide this information for this group, for that group? All of these kind of things. When you have the whole universe as a, you know, priority in terms of you have to focus somewhere. And so how could this be adapted? I mean, we call it a consulting project, but this could be, we use projects like this in different scopes in other classes as well, where it's simply a project. In some cases, we give the students the ability to choose their own project and work with a group. You know, classes we've had students pick. We matched up engineering students. I saw an engineering student over there. Matched up engineering students with the business students, and they worked on various projects that were relevant to those engineering fourth-year projects. Our students provided the marketing and the feasibility ideas around it, and the engineering students provided the technical ideas. We worked on a project to develop a solution for a Tanzanian entrepreneur who wanted to have a solar charging station. Well, the engineers designed a Cadillac of a charging system. And the business students had to come back and say, no, that's not feasible. You can't move that. You can't effectively use it. You can't get the right charge. It's too expensive. And those are the examples of things where we've modified other projects as well. So, she had some other things, Tricia.
Yeah, well, I'm going to speak from in terms of just some basic classroom stuff. So I always keep a picture of my students on my personal website and handy with me to inspire me. And this is my students in the town of Strasbourg. And they're just at the cafe, and it's the art of hanging out, listening, and meeting people on their own ground. And that's something I like to have my students doing. We do that right from week one, and out of that evolve different projects sometimes. In research techniques for journalism, that's actually where this trip came from, but in fall this past year, we did a project, it was People and Places, we did it with the North Central Community Association, and then we did a Wikipedia page and a magazine for the town of Okemaw, Saskatchewan, because a lot of the small towns and First Nations, they're not documented, and even though I don't let my students use Wikipedia as a source, that's where the majority of people go first, right? And so it's a way for these smaller communities to be represented on a very important website that they're unrepresented on. So the community members, these things evolve kind of naturally sometimes, like with the North Central project, I happened to be chatting with Jan Moyer about something completely different, and it evolved into this conversation somehow where my students were going to be working with her that semester. So she came into the classroom, gave them some good background. We also had the city archivist come into the classroom, so the students learned from them. And then went out and did interviewing and archival research into people and places in North Central. And with the town of Okemaw again, the students picked up, in a lot of these places, they want their elders to be interviewed, or their small town museums need some information. So it's really working with those towns and First Nations and providing students with an ability to learn interviewing techniques and research. So they get a lot out of it. The community gets documented. And like literally, it's that what people were saying today about erasure, right? Like being documented really helps, especially in this online world where lots of communities are missing from it. And also to have a magazine in your community that you can hand out. We send the magazines back to the town library usually, or the town office, or the band office. And I learn about community and make a lot of lasting connections that help my research later. The course where the students probably I have it most integrated is my Journalism 419 Alternative and Community Journalism. So in that case, it's like completely embedded in the whole semester. The first half is all on theory. So I go over like the idea of praxis, combining theory and action, so the students know why the course is structured that way. Because otherwise you could get a bunch of students saying like, why do we have to do this stuff? Because, I'm not learning anything. So explaining what the foundation is. Then we do like classroom learning on action research, and in the world of journalism, where I'm at, that's participatory media is kind of where that all hinges around. We look at examples of media from the community, whether it's community radio shows or actions that are centered around media. We bring in classroom visitors, I do, and the major assignment, that first half, is a case study. So that helps them learn how to do a case study, so they learn a technique, but also how to understand grassroots media and really look into how it's done out there before they're doing anything themselves. Then the second half after the winter break goes into the community-based component, and that is the students are entirely in the community working. We come back into the classroom for short classroom meetings, but they're primarily outside the classroom, and they have a choice of a community media project to work on, or a CSL, Community Service Learning Placement, is their choice. The community media project can be either a small group or individual project. Most of the students will kind of want to go together in 2s or 3s and do this. And there, if you choose the community media project, your role is to help to connect with a media disenfranchised community. So somebody who's not being represented in the media or wants to make media. So I help them a little bit with those connections, but often it's connections that students bring into the classroom. For example, we had a student who was quite involved with the Somali refugee community, so it was a natural that she should, connect with them, and they did a radio project together, for example. So it's often the students also bringing their own community connections in. The project planning part is like, I tell them what are the community's needs? How would they like to utilize media? I mean, we're a journalism school, so it usually has to involve some kind of media to help meet those needs. So you don't go in saying, I think we should do a photo voice project. You listen and you work it out. So I know some students were working with an ESL class at Open Door, and their idea was they'd maybe do a radio show. The students themselves in that ESL class said they wanted to do a poster project. They just wanted to see their pictures on the wall and know each other and have other people at Open Door know who they were and what their life stories were. So they interviewed each other and made posters. So that was one project. Other projects, some videos we've done, zines, some stuff that's been published in magazines that people in the community did. The logistical support I find is really important. So I give a letter from me to the community participants that's very clear. It's a grid outlining the purpose, the expectations, the limitations that the students only have 3 hours a week to do this or so, that the budget is limited. Also my contact info if they've got any problems or questions. So that's all on paper. The students also get something all on paper that's very specific about expectations, that there's guidelines. I give them an activity log sheet so they can log what they're doing. A small budget if I can find it and if it's required, but often it's me just doing stuff out of pocket for them. They can use our photocopy machine, stuff like that, equipment. So, and they also get to use, of course, our radio studio, TV studio, things like that. The graded assignment is the activity log, so they're expected to do about 20 hours, 18 to 20 hours in the community. A project evaluation or reflection plan that you create with the community members. How are we going to evaluate this project? I have to make it clear to the students that they're not evaluating, they're evaluating the experience, not the students' work, right? And then a written paper that the students do about the community partners. So they have to research and understand who they are, what their goals are, the project rationale, reflections, and also the community evaluation to attach that. Then there's class reports, maps, and presentations, things like that they get marked on. The community service learning one, that's again about 18, 20 hours. The placements are arranged by me. It's much more structured. The students choose from a list. And it'd be placements like, in the past, it's been like Prairie Dog and Human Rights Radio, Briar Patch, so nonprofit media, basically. Again, I give them an activity log. There's a mentor evaluation sheet, because in this case, it's a bit more formalized. So the editors at these publications or producers actually do provide some evaluation on the students, because the students are supposed to learn about, for example, if they're Prairie Dog, they have to learn the history of Prairie Dog, interview people involved with Prairie Dogs. So, and they're getting, basically some good volunteer time on the students. So I do ask them to do evaluations. And the students self-evaluate, and then I put that all together. The graded assignments, again, is a paper about the media outlet, interviews, research, reflections, participant observation, report backs, final presentation. So the assignments are pretty structured. So the student gets some hands-on understanding of community media. They learn how to work with community members. They learn from the community about issues. They get new connections. The community gets some media voice. They learn some new skills, some volunteer help, new connections with the university. And we've also had some lasting legacy projects come out of this, which I'm really proud of. I know one was a student, their job was to come up with a plan for the North Central Community Connection to be more like a newspaper. So they did all the research, and now it is a newspaper. It's on screen. We have another one that ended up as an archival project working with Saskatchewan Archives, where a community member's photo collection got archived. So there's some of these lasting legacies, and for me, I always get like lots of connections, information myself, and an opportunity to co-teach with the community. So for me, making it work means you consult early with the community in your curriculum planning. Like before I even came up with this curriculum, I talked to a lot of people. The students have to have a solid theory and methods foundation. The assignments have to be clear and structured, precise information for everyone participating, written down, lots of instructor involvement in the outreach, because maybe I'm over-controlling, but I don't want students like willy-nilly running to every group in the city and crossing paths, and I like to be quite involved in that process. And a very structured assessment plan that involves some community input. And finally, community ownership of the produced materials. So the students hand it off. Here's your disc, or here's what you produced, and they hand it back. The student doesn't keep it as their own. And then a lot of classroom sharing of the knowledge gains also has to be worked in, where the students are all sort of teaching each other what they're learning. So that's how it works for me. I'm not going to say that's exemplary. That's how I've done it. It could probably be improved in a million ways.
So do we want to stop with some questions?
Yeah, I was going to do just a quick little exercise, if that's okay.
Sure.
So it's a good thing we're on rolly chairs. To take maybe just 5 minutes or so, to group up in little groups of 2 or 3 and just reflect, because there's so much knowledge in this room, on kind of what we've said and how does that relate to some of the stuff that you're working on. You can just sort of tell each other what you're doing. So what I would do now is invite questions for the panel, but also reflections on what you talked about as a group too. If you've just got some general reflections on something you learned from your neighbor, or questions for us.
Maybe you have better ideas.
Maybe you have better ideas.
Take better
We'd love
ideas
to hear them. Yeah, if you've been involved in this kind of stuff and you have tips and ideas, let's just share our knowledge.
Sometimes what you choose to study can have unexpected impacts. It's one of my favorite jokes that I like to tell about a guy comes home late at night, his neighbors out on the sidewalk and read the street lamp. Most of you probably heard this before. looking, well, then the neighbor asked, oh, what's wrong? Dropped my keys, can't get into the house, and we're in so much trouble we don't get the light. So they're under the street lamp looking for a good half hour, and the guy says, what? Come on, can't find them, we've looked everywhere. Well, I've dropped them over there in the bushes. Well, why are you looking over here? Light's better over here.
Get what you want, right?
And that's often an artifact of research, is sometimes we go in having identified the subject of research, when there's this whole body of knowledge that's harder to get at, that we don't have the time or the resources to examine and criticize.
Absolutely.
You talked about approximately 25% of the information that you gained from the students, something that you hadn't thought the staff or you had not thought about before. Just wondering how you took that information. Maybe if you could give me just one example of how you maybe were able to implement it into action.
Well, I can give you an example. Implementation, we're not quite there yet,
Okay.
but one of the groups that was working on 2-in-1 Saskatchewan, how will we market this and promote it in the most cost-effective way, of course, because it's now beyond the scope of Regina, it's for the whole province, right? And so one of the teams had talked about it and thought about what it would be like to go specifically to Indigenous bands, present information one-on-one, very specific. And then they took it one step further and started to talk about the challenge that if you're in the nonprofit sector, you hear all the time about culturally appropriate services. And getting to the point of, if this database, this 2-in-1 Saskatchewan database, has information about 5,000 different programs and services, which it does, that are available for you to search and find what you're looking for, is there a way that you could do some of the legwork to determine whether or not they're culturally relevant services? And maybe that would be marked by an icon. And you know, we kind of went down this path of like a TripAdvisor. There's certain things that you want to filter out or filter for, and then determine which would be the best service for you. It would be very tricky because now who gets to say what's culturally appropriate and what's not, right? There'd be a lot more work to do. But I did find that very intriguing because we hear it all the time. You know, and there might be a way that we could say, this is what we mean by culturally appropriate services. You know, here are the indicators. And when you see this icon, you'll know that these things have been vetted. Something simple as that. So I love the idea. I think it's something that's definitely worth exploring. Have we implemented it yet? No. But we're certainly looking at how we can go further with that.
Thank you.
Well, the big question that came to my mind after listening to you guys present was, as a nonprofit or a CDO, how do we get involved in something like, how do we get students to consult for us for free or get some original content for our communication?
Well, there's different avenues. Often it's just through students you know or through profs you might know. But if you don't have that, then you can contact them. There's an arts internship program, for example, where students can, for credit, work with CDOs. So that's just kind of getting rejigged and off the ground again, and like some information on that. The community research unit can often direct people towards
I might be,
expertise
yeah,
in the area.
in the business school, we often get things that come from the dean's office. And so part of it is, you know, the complexity that is a university is you don't necessarily know who's doing what and those kind of things. But if you do have the connections that Trisha referring to, that's great. But if you had a marketing issue, then you could go now. If you're in a that approach can be taken by a variety of different areas, right? And so it's not just a business school problem. It could be something that could be really handled well by the arts faculty or fine arts faculty or something like that. So part of it is really understanding what you want to get out of this exercise. Typically, if you make the approach, if you can get a couple months in advance of a semester when the course outlines are reproduced, and you're flexible enough to wait to the end of the semester for a result. So that really means that you're probably a 6-week window or 6-month window to get something done. And so somebody that wants to get it done faster than that is faced with the challenge of having to probably pay for it or something like that. Now there are groups of students that are looking for, I don't think the art cares exists anymore though, right? I don't believe that project. That used to be a reading week exercise where the arts and Campion and Luther and other students as well went out over the reading week and worked with community organizations. But sometimes there's student bodies that do projects as well. But it's really making the connection with somebody that you think has some opportunity to offer. I mean, the universities, as complex as they are, you can see from a university website what the interests, the teaching interests somebody has, or things like that, and that might work as well. You can't call a switchboard and say, hey, I got this and expect an answer. But you can make the inroad with a connection that you think works, and don't assume that some of the other faculties and so forth can't do all of those things as well. There could be classes in each of the programs that could really fit. And if you look at business students, they're not. I'm going to completely generalize. They're not terribly creative. There are some that are, but we seem to beat out the creativity by giving them through all these functional areas in them. So if I wanted something that was a lot more creative, I might go to an arts faculty or fine arts faculty or something like that, depending what I wanted to do. But every single university student understands how to solve a problem. Just ask them to find a parking space; they'll find it for you. And, but every single program deals with basically, we can call it this program, we can call it that, but every single program teaches a student how to do some great critical thinking to get an output. And if that's really what you're looking for, is then pick a program that you think might make sense to your students, and try to match it. Now, our business students go out and we have our students do a 5 days for the homeless, where we do work with the Carmichael raise. I think we're the second largest fundraising or largest fundraising with them right now. And it's a massive, and it's great. And other student groups do the same thing, and it doesn't really matter the scale. But those students might be involved in a whole bunch of different ways you can get them involved. And if I wanted to get a student group involved in something, I'd probably contact the student union, the URSU, and ask them to see, because they ultimately are umbrella for all those smaller groups too.
I would also recommend the Regina Public Interest Research Group, which helps connect students to community, and also to enter in with a thought of like a fulsome partnership. Thinking about what you want students to learn from you as a community and as an organization, and really work that out with the instructors involved. Because I get 10 phone calls a day for people. Oh, it'd be really great if your students did a video on this, and it's sort of like, but it's got to be a little bit more community involved and community engaged in that, and a lot more back and forth, and that's why, because you're not, it's not like a free labor thing, right? It's a learning experience, it's a curriculum experience, it's a chance for students to learn and have their learning evaluated, assessed, and things like that. So that does, thinking of it that way. But our group is great, community research unit. As you suggested, go on websites, see. Professors love to hear from people in the community and get ideas and spark ideas. There was one here first.
I'm just going to add that before you go on. For our perspective, we started with the Center for Management Development.
Yeah, at the business school.
Business school, and that was really useful because they were able to help us sort of filter through what our needs are and where would be the best way to go from there and build a project. That's how it really got connected to Bruce at that point. So that's another.
Johnson Shoyama, anybody from Johnson Shoyama? Are in the conference, but those policy students take on a free project in January, I think, every year, obviously it's an advocacy research kind of related project around policy, but if that's an interest and you can fit into those schematics, then there's some of that as well too, so.
There's a question back here. I just have a very pragmatic question about course design from a university instructor perspective, and I think, Bruce, you alluded to it a little bit in your previous answer. And as you know, I've designed an undergraduate undergraduate level course on human-animal relationships and the animal question, the whole spectrum of that, of which there is an advocacy component and a community service component. And my question would be, just from your experience with students coming into your project, if I'm thinking of my students and what would their learning objectives be, what were some of the pieces that were missing for your students when they came into the project that perhaps they could have had in previous classes coming into a grad program like that? Like, what sorts of skills would it have been helpful for them to have already had sort of under their belt before they entered into a project like that?
Something that you might categorize in communication of some sort, whether it's in business, we might call it marketing. In other classes, we might call it writing. We might call it, something, a research-related class is really important.
Yeah.
Research methods or something like that would be helpful for them. Those are useful sort of routes of access.
And what were some of the gaps that your students had when they came in that they had?
And our students aren't all created equally. They have, some are born and raised in Regina and, understand that particular environment. Others had to understand it. They didn't have the concept of what this was or what that was, and they had to create that. And so we were able to orientate them to that and mix and match some of the teams so that we asked them to pick teams that reflected different skill sets and things like that as well. But those are a bit of challenge with some of that.
I'm curious about the evaluation part from a point of view of a community-based organization and services, because you have talked about business-like.
Yep.
So how do you measure how effective you were in that community that provides services to people, and how do you meet their needs? Because I can see the part of the students, you rate the students, you give them grades, and you guide them and whatever, but what happened in the other part of the community house, is there any tool that you can evaluate the effect of what happened with that research and that action, if you have any action, to see how people benefit from that? Because it's really hard when you provide services for people, it's not tangible, right? And you can't hold it in your hand. So that's what I'm curious, if there's anything.
Well, my response to that is we don't have a formal tool that does that, but when there was a set of outcomes that I had for the class, which are shared somewhat to extents or diffused when I get down to the class, but these are outcomes that Robyn and I understood. And so, she wanted, some of it is you want the information in a certain way. You want it to be communicated a certain way. You want to be, the ways and procedures and those kind of things. And so we defined what those outcomes were. And then at post the event, we sat down and talked about it. And we talked about whether those outcomes were achieved or not. And so that helps us plan for the future projects and things like that. But we didn't have a formal evaluation tool, because you're right. We kept I didn't want to put the onus of evaluation on the United Way, and because they're not teaching the content, and so they can certainly participate in some parts of it, but I couldn't put the onus on them because, as Robyn said, it was, very difficult to critique, in essence, a bunch of volunteers that showed up to do work for you. And so I was okay with critiquing them, because that's my role, but it was tougher for her to do that.
I think in my case, evaluation was built into it, but in a different, we're not evaluating the students per se, but the value of the project. So we did a segment where we talk about evaluation and look at different forms of evaluation, because really with community-based research, that reflexive practice is really important. So why you do it, and you know, at what points in the project do you stop and reflect and evaluate, and how you invite the community to sort of lead that process is the tack that I used in my class. And so the students that was part of the assignment, is you sit down with your community people and ask them that question. How do we know this is helping? How do we know it isn't? You know, what are our expectations? How are we going to know if this is worthwhile or not? And the idea that it can be done in very different ways depending on the communities you're working with. You know, for some it could be you could develop a survey. For others, you might want to have a forum. Just all the different. Some people evaluate by drawing pictures, whatever, right? Like trying to make it creative in different ways you can do it. Because for me, it's also the students are learning the whole practice of community research and why that's important.
I like that. I'm just going to jump into it.
Yeah, please.
Perspective too. We didn't have a formal way of evaluating, but you know, one of the things that we wanted to take away from the experience was challenging ourselves to think about who we're speaking to, who's the audience, because right or wrong, it's easier from our perspective to speak to everybody in one voice. We're talking to everybody. Make that message so generic that anyone can fit into it. Yeah, exactly. But through the process, as we started to talk more about it, it's really not about that. And it's about creating these personas and something that's, the messaging and the follow-up behind it will be meaningful to one target audience and very different for another. So we have to have a series of ways to communicate what we're trying to get across, which was really helpful for us because it was leading up to where we're doing a broad province-wide launch of our service. And that was really a big takeaway. We talk all the time in different community forums about, get around the table those, don't just have the people that you always talk to, bring those other voices to the table. Okay, but what does that really mean? And until I was actually in that room and hearing from all these students who were bringing back tangible examples of who we don't talk to, that was huge for us. And now we can better plan out how we need to go and talk differently and engage that audience in a new way.
Just a clarification, personas is just a social media marketing term for a target market, a segment. So it includes age, everything around demographics, behavior. How do I buy? What things do I lead? Do I follow Facebook? Do I follow Instagram? All of those things creates a profile. And you can create a profile that says, this person of this kind of age behaves like this generally, and that helps you market to that group. And then there's a different kind of group. So, so that's a persona. Just I raised it, and I should probably explain it.
I just wanted to get some clarification. Were these students undergraduates or graduates in both?
In my case, undergrads.
Undergrads. At what level? First or?
They were first year journalism students for the research class and second year for the alternative community media class.
The first,
that makes them second. Our program starts, so they're third year and fourth year.
Okay.
But first and second year journalism students, they start.
Maybe you have a different experience. My feeling is that first and second year students are just trying to separate from mom right now, and I don't mean that in a negative way.
Ours are a little, because they've had 2 years.
I don't mean that in a negative way, but you know exactly what I'm saying. They're still trying to find out what they want to do, and but we've had I've done projects that are community-based projects. I had a series of students do work with Regina Housing Group, and these students produced a result, an outcome that talked about how they could improve the operations of Regina Housing. That would have been a $100,000 consulting project, and it was probably better than that. But that's unusual, and so our students that we do a lot of these things tend to be third and fourth year students, or graduate students.
Okay, because I was just thinking that I'm in nursing, but they don't do community-based project, but they do community service learning at first year, so first term. Yeah, and most of them, yeah, they are young 17-year-olds, so it's kind of, you are exposing them to the community, so they're involved in what kind of project that they find. So they go into long-term care, communities, different places. So for them, it's more of, like we want them to learn how to communicate, like, it's more like volunteers. But then some of them actually get involved in some projects, and then you can see that by the end of the term, they are really grown. Yeah, so although they come very young, but at the end, most of them, you see that they have really developed their communication skills. That some of them, they're so scared even to talk to someone, like when they go into the long-term care, for example, they say they don't know how to talk to the elderly people. But at least at the end of the term, they will say that they have improved so much, like in terms of communication or maybe collaboration and something like that. So, but we don't have it at the higher level.
It's true. I mean, the students early stage are getting out of high school and they're still dealing with all those kind of pieces, and you get some outstanding students. I wouldn't shy away from using high school students for consulting projects either.
Yeah.
I think that would be, so one of the values that United Way was looking for is, what are our students? They're a certain age demographic, usually. And so it's really interesting to find information about that demographic. And one of the things that those students are really good at is they know what their demographic is, and they know how they communicate. And so we've had organizations come to us and say, I need to be in front of those people. How do I do it? Well, you should ask those students, and the students are really good at that. And the younger students are just as capable of that particular exercise of understanding what they need to do. And so that was a value that we found with this piece. If we had, we did a consulting project the previous time, and we worked with the town of Nipawin. And we worked on economic development projects, and the students did a great job with that. But it was harder for them to relate. They weren't in Nipawin, it wasn't something they understood. But it was successful projects because they did an outcome that the organization wanted, but that was what we did. So, you had a question?
Well, not even a question.
Or comment,
Because
yeah.
someone was asking about resources and getting, and this is just a resource I'm sharing, because these projects take a lot of time and the threshold seems high, but it doesn't have to be that high, and we don't need a lot of resources. But one resource that just got developed a few weeks ago, Arthur has developed mini grants of up to $200. It's not a whole grant application. It's just an email saying, and you can send it to under your organization's letterhead saying, we want to hold a community event, a meeting, or something. And the maximum is only $200, but for $200, you could put on a lunch and get the community members together. And it's to make it very accessible. You don't even need to be a member of Arthur. So if you want to find the email, or Trish has probably their email.
Yep, yeah, they're in the kit too.
Oh yeah,
Yep,
they're in the kit. So it's a $200 micro grant. I don't know how widely, but it's a resource. It's not a question or even a comment. It's a resource. What can you do with $200? But you can do
You
something.
bring people together, and that's always the beginning. Sometimes that's all you need is just to get people in a room.
Yeah, and you don't really have to spend a lot of time thinking about criteria.
And we've had people in a room, and we've overstayed our time. There's coffee downstairs, and then on to the next session. So